because I have, oh yeah, well, all right, well, let's get started, because I have lots of stuff I want to make sure I have time to demo. Oh, my name is Jeff Hicks. I am a long-time, old PowerShell MVP. Most of you have read my books. I've said hi to a number of you. Thank you for all your support over the years. Today, I want to talk about a topic here that comes up a lot. By this point in the day, you've seen these slides. So I do a lot of training, teaching people about PowerShell. I help out in forums. People email me. I'm on Twitter. And I see a lot of the same problems over and over again. And a lot of this comes around this idea of creating what I call secure code. And as some of you are beginner scripters, hopefully I will give you some ideas of things. Oh, maybe I should write my code this way to avoid having Jeff get mad at me. So a lot of this talk has come from just my seeing what other people have done and realizing, why are you doing that? So there's a lot of bad habits out there, and I want to try to maybe get you down the path of avoiding some of those bad habits. So it really comes down to what I call about how secure is your code. Number one, can you share it freely? I don't know how many times someone said, oh, I've got this cool function that does X. I go, cool, can you show it to me? No, give me an hour, I got to sanitize it, and no. You are doing something wrong if you can't show me your code. So that's like the number one thing that really bugs me when people say, nah, it's not free, and it should be. Or people will say, yeah, I know, I have to hide the source code. I don't want the person running my script to be able to see what's inside. And my initial thought is, you're doing something wrong. Because what are you trying to hide? You should not be trying to hide anything. The other thing that comes along with this is how easy or hard is it to test your code? Or to make your code transportable? As you are going to see, a lot of this comes from people having a practice where they hard code the wrong things. And having a lot of hard-coded information makes your code much harder to troubleshoot, much harder to test. So I'm going to show you a number of ways eventually on how we can get around that. Now, a big thing and here is that there's no difference. Remember this, for those of you who are, again, kind of new to PowerShell. There's no difference between running a script versus someone opening up that file, copying and pasting the code and slapping it into PowerShell. If they have the right permissions and the right tools to run that code, PowerShell will happily run it. Okay? So you have to keep that in mind. There's no difference between what's in a script versus what someone can just copy and paste into the console. If you cannot freely share your code, if I can't say, hey, let me show me what you're working on. Say, no, because there's company stuff in there, you're doing it wrong. Now, I do have a little disclaimer here, a little asterisk. There are exceptions, I understand, for if your company has some specific business IP, intellectual property concerns. You may have some code that is giving your company a competitive advantage. I understand that. That's a business decision. But there should be no technical reason that you can't show me your code. If there is, because there's something that is sensitive or confidential, that stuff should not be in your code. And I'll go through and show you some ways to get around that. What I'd like you to start thinking about, especially again, for those of you who are new to scripting, is this idea of separating the data that you need to run your code from the code itself. It comes really easy to just, oh yeah, let me just put in the variable and I'll just hard code in the data. Don't put the data in your script. We want to separate things. The values and data that you need to run your script should not be part of the code itself. The code itself is free. It should run, anyone should be able to run it, look at it. The code that you need that might implement it, that's separate. That can be protected. And it should be protected. What you may end up doing, though, is creating what we call controller scripts to say, okay, here's my data source, and here's my PowerShell code. The controller script will then put those two things together. So like say the help desk. You may write a controller script that calls the tool, your code, and then integrates in the data that it needs to do its job. That way, because the big thing here for a lot of people is, yeah, I don't want the help desk to see what's in my code. Well, yeah, it's because you have hard-coded stuff that you don't want them to see. If you write the right controller script, you could actually bring in the code that you need to run the code, and the user has no idea what that code is. And if they look at the source code of the script, there's nothing there but just PowerShell. So keep this in mind, this idea of separating the data you need from the code itself. Now, what about creating an executable version, like you can in PowerShell Studio? No. Seriously, no. All that is doing is creating a .NET obfuscation of the code. It's not a real executable. It can be reverse engineered. It's not real security. Again, if you feel I have to hide the code, you're doing it wrong. If you really need an executable for the sake of giving someone something to double-click on a desktop, fire Visual Studio, become a developer, learn C# and write an application. But for a PowerShell script, the executable gives you a false sense of security. So seriously, no. All right, so let me talk about some of the things that I have come up with on this idea of getting around separating your data from your code. Now, just for anyone yells at me, I'm using the IC because for demo purposes, the IC is a much better tool for demonstration than Visual Studio Code. Okay? And for a little tip here, a little bonus for those of you who do presentations, and you should all eventually be doing presentations for someone. In the IC, you know, if I press F5, I might accidentally run the whole script. I don't want to do that, so I always put a little return statement at the beginning saying, hey, don't do this, you doofus, because this is not a script, it's a walkthrough. So this way, if I accidentally hit F5, Jason's looking at me like, what? No, that's pretty awesome. Yeah, so if I accidentally run the script and hit F5, all I get is a warning, hey, don't do that. You're supposed to walk through this step by step.
Hey, wait, bring that up. Hang on, wait. Okay, you're good.
All right, so first thing I want to show you here is something that you might want to do. Because one of the things that a lot of people try to do is which they should not do, right? I can't believe I have to say this, but you do not hard code any sort of credential in your scripts, right? Everyone hopefully understands that, but there's always someone who thinks, oh, because it's easy to do, you should always be prompting for credentials, but I know there are times where we need some flexibility. So I have a module that I wrote a year or so ago that will allow you to store a credential in a JSON file. And I have the links here for the module. It's a module that's up on the PowerShell gallery called PS JSON credential. And within this module are a couple commands to import or export the credential. And you can look at the help here. So I'm going to create a credential for Art Deco in my company domain. So just so everyone knows, that is a PS credential. So the password is stored as a secure string. my export PS credential command, I just specify the name of my JSON file and my credential. And I'm not going to run that because I already have that file. So this is doing the conversion of the secure string the same way that you would do it with export CLI XML. So this will only work on this machine, if I remember that right. But I also include a little metadata as to where this credential came from. So now this JSON file is relatively secure. Now, if someone has access to my machine, yeah, they can reverse and get the password. But if they can have access to my machine, you have bigger problems.
They have to have access to your machine and access to this file.
Yes, yeah.
And just to be clear, this is using the Windows Data Protection API.
Right.
So it encodes it so that that can only be reversed from wherever you read that machine, that password from that machine.
So this is something, again, a lot of things I'm going to show you are things that you might consider, but you still have to do the rest of your job in terms of protecting and security, okay? Just because I can show you this doesn't mean that this is all there is that you have to do, okay? A lot of people think, oh, PowerShell makes it so easy. Well, yes, but that doesn't mean that you're done. This is just the first step. So I use stuff like this in my profile because I want to create credentials and stuff automatically, but I don't want to have to be constantly putting in passwords. And I know that I'm in much greater control of my environment, so I'm okay with that. You may not be. Anyway, so I have this JSON file.
Any particular reason you are not using import and export CLI now, which comes out of the box?
Size, and it was just like, I wonder if I can do JSON, because JSON seems to be used. The XML file is bigger, not tremendously bigger, but it was bigger. No, you're right. You could easily do the same sort of thing. The other thing I wanted to do was I wanted to be able to have that little metadata.
Yeah, I like that metadata. I think that's always useful.
Because now, like with this get PS credential from JSON, that basically converts very simple, just call it convert from JSON. But now I can see where that came from. And again, all that is ready. And so when I'm ready, I can just import the credential from the JSON file. It just reverses everything. I have a nice verbose output. There's my credential imported. And just to show you, that is the actual password for Art Deco. So I have a little tool that allows me, if I need to be able to store a credential to disk. Technically, that's not a good thing to do, right? You're not supposed to do it, but you have to weigh convenience with security. So if you have to do it, this is one thing that you could look at. So now I could create my credentials, store them in a JSON file, import them. When I import, that creates the actual PS credential object, and then use that. Any other questions on that? And again, that module's on the gallery, PS JSON credential. Another technique that you might want to use, and because that's using the data API, that is Windows PowerShell only. I don't believe that's on PowerShell Core. And that's also true of my next technique here, the data API. I don't think it is. I can double check that, but right, not on Linux, yeah. Oh yeah, it'll work on Windows, on a Windows platform, PowerShell Core, but not on Linux. And that's also going to be true of CMS messages. Anyone here use CMS messages? This is another command that I think is woefully underappreciated. So this was introduced in PowerShell version 5 to be used. Microsoft uses a lot for its logging, to protect the logging from hackers and all of that. But you can also use it to create encrypted files, and this is done with a certificate. It's a specific document encryption certificate. If you read the help for Protect CMS Message, you'll see an example on how to do all of that. So I already have on my computer, I have a document encryption certificate. And I have the subject set to, that's not even really my email address, but it kind of looks like an email address. So I can say, hey, I want to protect this string, I'm the walrus, and I want to protect that as a CMS message. And it's encrypted using the certificate forgot one part. So actually I've got two of them on my machine. So these are certificates that can encrypt data. And so now $A, that little string, I'm the walrus, is now encrypted. Now this file is transportable, but it can only be decrypted by some machine that has that same certificate. So that's a little more useful than the data API stuff. And then you can unprotect the message to get the string back. So again, if you needed a way to just say, hey, I want to be able to just store a plain text password, if you needed to, you could protect it as a CMS message.
So you were able to unprotect it because that message identifies the key
Yes.
required.
Yes.
It looked up that key.
It saw that I had the certificate on my machine and just made it happen.
So if you do that on another machine and you didn't have the certificate, you get,
It would fail.
but if you registered that certificate there, it would work.
Yeah.
What about if I'm using a different login account? So I think because the certificate is stored in your current program.
Yes. This is only for me. So it possibly could depend upon where that certificate is installed. Usually, as far as I know, we want those document encryption certificates to be personal. Although you can probably install it per machine. I have a thing I'm going to show you tomorrow where actually I also use CMS messages to protect some content. And I think because I'm sharing the certificate across machines, I think on one of them they're installed. No, actually they're both installed per user because I'm using a user, an account to run something. So.
This is for logging, and we have a centralized log server which generates a public key, and everybody gets that, and then they encrypt with it, and send the logs up, and then it gets encrypted with their private key, so it's not personal.
So anyway, I did all of that demo just to show you how the CMS stuff works. Now, let's take another step here. So I've got a kind of a demo function here called get something, just write the little dummy object to the pipeline. And what I want to do, now let me run that so in case you want to see what it looks like. All right, so I have the function now in my function PS drive. And I'm going to delete it. I want to make sure that it's not really there now. So I'm going to protect using my certificate. I'm going to basically protect that script file, the PS1 file, and I'm going to save it to an out file called cmscmd.ps1, which I've already created. I don't want to recreate it and break my demo here. So now there is the CMS version of that script file. Okay, everyone with me so far? So basically what you see there is the CMS version of that file. So now I want to be able to run this file. Oop. Now I could just run unprotect CMS message just to prove that it will undo it. But I have another command here that I wrote called import my command that basically is going to unprotect the CMS message, create a temp version of the file, get the function names, so let's load that function. Clear screen here. So now I've reloaded that file. The user has no idea what the code is for get something. Now, if they know, if they're sophisticated enough to look in the function PS drive, yeah, they could probably see the code. But they just now know, oh, I can just run get something. And it works. Oh, good grief. Yeah, so what I end up doing is I create a dynamic module from bringing the function in. And so this little thing here is just more proof of concept, where I could take a script file, protect it as a CMS message. So if I have, again, I still want to separate my data from my code, which I'm going to get to next. But if I want to really hide the contents of the script from the user, I can make a CMS version of my source code, use my little the import the command, and then give them the commands, and then they can just run it, and they just come from this dynamic module. As soon as I close my PowerShell session, this dynamic module goes away. Go back. No, I'm here. All right, so let's look at some scripting options. And hopefully my demo's all set. So I'm going to run, just for the sake of the demo, I'm going to do all my demos inside my company domain. So let me jump into that. All right. So here's a function, something that I would kind of see out there. It's got some problems, right? I have hard-coded names for like the domain and a domain controller and stuff. We don't want to do that. It's very easy to do. You think, oh yeah, I'm done. But this is the kind of thing that people say, oh, I have to sanitize before you can look at it. Because I can't show you my domain name. I can't show you server names. If you're doing stuff like this now, you need to stop right now. But I'm going to show you some ways we can get around that. So this works. I can actually go ahead and this is not, this is not a very exciting function. It's just going to say, hey, find me all the users in the sales department. Okay? But it's doing that with some hard-coded values. So I don't want to do that. I need to get away from that. So here's the next iteration. A better approach is to parameterize these things. So instead of hard-coding in the domain name and whatnot, make them parameters. And in fact, make them parameters that take pipeline input, ideally. You could still set hard-coded default values. That kind of becomes now a gray area, though, of separating your data from code. Makes it easier to run, but I kind of like this approach. Because now, if I do this properly here, let's let's load this version of the function. So here's the cool thing. So I'm going to cheat here and just create a little here string of data, which is basically looks like a CSV file. There's my OU, the domain, DC, because my function takes input from the pipeline, right? If I do like convert from CSV or import CSV, right? I get an object. And each of those, because the property names match the name of my parameter, PowerShell will hook those two things together. So I can say, hey, import the data that I need to run my script for the OU and the domain, and then pipe it to get domain user, my function. I'm still going to specify the sales department, but then my code just works. Now this line here, this is the kind of thing that you would, if you wanted to make it even easier for, say, the help desk, you might create a controller script or function to simplify that process. This data, it could come from anywhere. It could come from a SQL database. It could come from, so you wanted to have data that the user couldn't see, yeah, you could still just bring it in. Or another option, again, another feature that I don't think enough people use. How many of you use PS default parameter values? Yeah, you should be. So instead of putting in default values for my parameters, I'm going to do it with the PS default parameters. You can populate this, and this is a built-in variable. It's a hash table. You could populate this any number of ways. You could write in your controller script a way that automatically puts that puts that information in. You could have some sort of custom profile that you distribute or is pulled in from other places. But I'm going to go through and add those default values. So the syntax is the name of your command, colon, and then the parameter, and then the value. So instead of hard coding in the value in the function, I'm going to do it here. So I can get my lines lined up. So I have those values, and now I can run get domain user. All I had to specify was just the manufacturing department. All the other values that I need, the domain and OU and whatnot, were called automatically from PS default parameter values. Another way of separating the data that I need to run my code from the actual code itself. Yeah, so I don't need to hard code anything in the function itself. So if someone needs to look at this code, there's nothing in here that is proprietary or confidential or sensitive. It's basically just running get AD user, just Microsoft code. This also makes this function much easier to pester test, because if I want to, I can pass in fake domain names and OU names, and I can mock get AD user to be whatever I want. I don't have to worry about having hard-coded values that I have to test around. Let's look at another option here. Any questions so far? Hopefully some of you are maybe thinking about things that you can do. One other option that you might have, and this is a bit more advanced. So for those of you, again, who are still kind of learning PowerShell, don't feel, if this makes your head spin a bit, that's okay. You have access to all the demos. The more you do this, you'll get more comfortable with it. And this is to put your data in something like a PSD1 file, a configuration data file. In DSC, we use PSD1 files all the time. Well, you can use them for your own scripts. So this version takes a string for configuration data. And in fact, that string is actually the path to a PSD1 file. A couple ways you could do this. So the PSD1 file, the configuration data, is basically just a hash table. So it's kind of a variation on parameter binding. So there's my OU domain in DC. This file, this PSD1 file, I could start combining some of my other techniques. I could encrypt this as a CMS message, so that if someone were to look at that PSD1 file, they couldn't see it. But maybe my code then could, again, controller script, that would unprotect the PSD1 file and then feed it into my function. So the configuration data, I then import the PowerShell data file. And that creates a hash table, and then I can just plug in my values that I'm pulling. The $config is from that imported config data file. Now, what I don't know is if I have set this up, oh, good, I did. Because I'm in my Windows 10 VM, so I couldn't remember if I copied my PSD1 file from my laptop to the VM, and I did. So now I can still run my command, get domain user, but the data that I need for that command to run, this potentially sensitive information, is pulled from a separate file. I don't need to see the data file. In fact, this makes my get domain user much more transportable. If Jason wants to use this in his domain, he can use the code. He does not have to make any changes whatsoever to the code. I mean, how many of you, what's your first thing you do when you need something new in PowerShell? How many of you go to Google, Bing? Come on, I know you all do. Yeah. Because I've had students tell me, oh, yeah, I go and then they spend the next 3 days trying to find all the places in the code that they have to edit and modify because the person who wrote it hard-coded lots of stuff, and they got to go through and change it all for their environment. That's a whole nother session. Whereas if you have a code like this where the data that you need is separate. Now, if I were to do this, say this function here, I would definitely make sure, again, this is just kind of a proof of concept, I would definitely make sure that this command had plenty of documentation explaining how to set up and use the configuration data. Okay? I'm showing you, but I mean, if you look at this now, you'd have no idea, what that is. But again, makes my code easier. It's more secure because there's nothing in here that is sensitive, right? It's just plain PowerShell and Microsoft commandlets. Nothing here that I have to protect. The config data I might want to protect, will want to protect, yeah.
Yeah, so if you need to store confidential data in your PSD1, like credential, for instance, you will encrypt the
I would encrypt it. You'd want to make sure you've got proper access control. All those things you would normally do to protect files, absolutely. You have to think about, though, I always tell people when I'm teaching them scripting and tool making, you always have to keep in mind who is going to be using this thing that I'm creating. What is their expectation? What is their proficiency in PowerShell? Will they know enough to know to run this with parameters and do a path? Do I need to create a GUI and then abstract a lot of this stuff inside the GUI? That's another possibility. So the only code they would see would be the GUI, which is then calling all the other code that you need. That would be another way of doing what I call a controller script. So you got to think about who's going to use this. But ultimately, you want your data to be separate. The data that you need to run your code should be separate from the code itself. And that's probably the biggest takeaway that I want you to have. Any other questions on the demos here before I go back to the slides? Anything else you want to see? Pretty much everything I've just talked about is my chapter in the PowerShell conference book, which is for those of you who don't know, this book is a charity project. It's all the proceeds, none of the authors, number of speakers here either have worked on this book, and all the benefits go towards a scholarship program to bring people who are new into the industry to be able to go to the PowerShell Global Summit that we hold in Bellevue, Washington every year, to get them up to speed learning PowerShell. It's on LeanPub. You can get a hard copy print version from Amazon. The LeanPub version, if you buy that book, you have it forever. If we make updates for fixing bugs or something, then you get the new version. Questions? Other answers? Oh, actually, I do have one other thing here that I forgot here. Go back to my code, my demo. Because there are some other steps that you could think about. For example, GIA is another possibility, depending upon what you need to do. You could set up a GIA endpoint and create your own proxy functions, and because that then really hides a lot of the code from the end user. Most of the time when I run into this, it's because the IT pro who wrote the script, they don't want the help desk to see the code. Most of the time it's because they're doing something foolish like hard coding sensitive data that they don't want them to know, which they shouldn't be doing in the first place. But GIA would be another way of separating that out and protecting the code and limiting what the user can do. And again, you can combine a lot of these things I've shown you. Anyone else have any other ideas about how you might separate your data from code or challenges for stuff that I have brought up here? They want to go home and start changing your code, realizing, oh, yeah, I'm doing that, and I shouldn't do that. Because I know at least one of you is hard coding stuff, and you're realizing, yeah, I shouldn't do that. Jason's thinking, oh, God.
No, I'm looking at some of those. Oh, hi, Sebastian. My computer. Huh? Did you access my computer? Yeah, actually, I'm looking at it right now.
Yeah. All of my material for today and actually tomorrow is up on my GitHub site. Questions? Is any of that useful? You all just want to go find something to drink or cool down.
Have you considered a copy credential to send it to another machine and re-encode it for the API on that machine using sessions?
No.
I implemented a function for that in the TechNet gallery. I implemented a function that does on the old TechNet gallery, not on the PowerShell gallery.
Well, come on, get with it. It's 2018.
Haven't yet migrated it, admittedly. It's using quite old technology, but it does it for beginners. Especially, it was designed in order to encrypt credentials as system. That a scheduled task is running as the computer account actually can access and protect the credentials object. So it was implemented using the task scheduler. So I can register the task as a encrypt credential or protect credential. Either way should not give you the results.
And there are plenty of other, third-party credential managers out there. So I worked with one company this year And they actually built their own credentialing system. And the admins, they don't even know what credentials they're using. They just know they got to the password vault, get the credential, and then just use it. So they have no idea what the password even is. And it's some long, obscene thing. So, oh yeah. Yeah, so they basically have PowerShell code that goes out, grabs the credential, feeds it into what they need, and so they have no idea. So you're not limited to just PowerShell. And you want to separate what you need from what you're going to do with it. And too many people don't do that right now. Because it's very easy to fall into that trap, go, oh, let me just do it and get it done. Now the data protection API is something different, yeah. It's a .NET thing. Yeah. Which is why it's not on Linux. It should run on PowerShell core on Windows, but not on Linux or Mac. Other questions? Yeah, those credentials, and then there are other things that you might need that potentially is sensitive, like even like an API key, for example.
Yeah, absolutely, same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's where the point now. A lot of people don't think of APIs keys like credentials, but they are. They absolutely are. And people who made that mistake and then published their code to GitHub have found, like, hackers using
Yeah.
Bitcoin, and they racked up tens of thousands of dollars in bills before they're like, what's going on?
The worst is the username and the password at the same time. It's gone. No bueno.
Yeah, so I keep, like, my API keys are set as set as PowerShell variables. So the code the few functions I have that use those API keys, they default to the variable. So I can show people that code without ever having to expose my actual API.
By the way, while we're at it about embarrassing GitHub disclosures, if you accidentally disclose an API key, no pull request removing that file is not going to remove it from your history. It has happened. The safest way is to completely discard the entire repository and build a new. I think there were means to clean up the history by the time.
All right, so I'm on Twitter. It's probably the best way to find me. I'll be here all day tomorrow. Thank you very much.